He thought he'd hidden the tears in the empty break room, but his 5-year-old daughter's voice cut through the silence. What none of them realized was that someone else had overheard, the new boss, who wasn't supposed to care. "Mommy, why is Daddy crying?" Before we dive in, take a moment. Drop a comment below, letting us know where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will absolutely blow your mind. The office smelled like paper and disinfectant, the kind of sterile scent that clung to everything and nothing all at once. Daniel Whitaker sat in a chair too small for his frame, knees bent awkwardly, back hunched as though he'd already been defeated before the meeting even began. Across from him, a manager he barely knew read from a crisp sheet of paper. The words came out measured, careful, but they may as well have been carved into stone. Downsizing, restructuring, cost-cutting measures, efficiency protocols, words that dressed themselves as professional but landed like blunt weapons. Daniel didn't hear sentences. He heard indictments. Not good enough, not necessary, not worth keeping. His hands trembled as he clasped them together on the table, trying to keep the shake invisible. The manager avoided his eyes, staring instead at the legalese on the page as though it could shield him from guilt. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement of the years Daniel had given, the late nights he'd stayed past everyone else, the holidays he'd missed at home to keep shipments moving, accounts balanced, promises fulfilled. Just the paper, the practice tone, and a cardboard box already waiting by the door like a coffin for his career. 15 years, he thought. 15 years reduced to a folder of exit paperwork and a list of severance terms that sounded more generous on paper than they would feel in reality. He signed where he was told, pen scratching across the line with a finality that hollowed him out. No handshake, no thank you. Just the sterile nod of a bureaucrat doing his job. Daniel almost wanted to laugh, but the sound stuck in his throat, sour and sharp. An HR assistant appeared like a shadow, polite smile plastered on her face, and gestured toward the door. Escort procedure. Policy. As though he might steal the stapler on his way out or sabotage the company he had once defended like it was his own blood. He carried the box under his arm, the weight absurd compared to the years it represented. A framed photo of Sophie with chocolate ice cream smeared across her cheeks. A chipped coffee mug that read, "Number 1 Dad." A few books with notes scribbled in the margins, reminders of training sessions he once led with pride. That was all his service amounted to now, knickknacks in a box. The lobby was quiet when he stepped out. His coworkers knew better than to meet his eyes. They'd heard the rumors, and no one wanted to be caught lingering too long near a sinking ship. He walked across the polished floor, every footstep sounding louder than it should, echoing against marble and glass. When the door finally swung open, the winter air struck him like a slap. Sharp, biting, unrelenting. He pulled his coat tighter around him, but it wasn't the wind that froze him. It was the emptiness inside. On the sidewalk, he paused, staring at his reflection in the glass doors of the building. He expected to see himself, tired but capable, weathered but still standing. Instead, he saw a ghost. Hollow eyes, slumped shoulders, a man erased by the world he'd devoted his life to. He didn't see Daniel Whitaker, employee, provider, husband, father. He saw absence, a shadow, something disposable. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine how he would tell Maria, how he would put words together that didn't sound like failure, how he would smile, make a joke, reassure her that they would be fine. And Sophie, sweet Sophie with her drawings taped to the fridge, who believed her daddy could fix anything. How would he tell her that he couldn't fix this, that the world had decided he was unnecessary? He practiced the words in his head, but they all sounded like lies. The box shifted in his arms, and one of Sophie's crayon drawings fluttered loose, caught in the breeze before he snatched it back. A house. 3 figures, stars above their heads. He clutched it against his chest, the paper crumpling under his grip. A lump rose in his throat, thick and unyielding. He wanted to cry, but swallowed it down. Not here. Not yet. The wind howled down the street, tugging at his coat, pushing him forward. He took a breath, heavy and jagged, and began to walk. Each step felt like carrying a burden no one else could see. He told himself he'd figure it out, that men like him always did. But as the city blurred around him, he couldn't shake the reflection in the glass. He couldn't shake the truth. He no longer felt like a man with a future. He felt like a man fading, one gust of wind, away from vanishing completely. And the cruelest part was knowing he still had to go home and pretend otherwise. The apartment smelled faintly of garlic and tomato, the cheap jarred sauce bubbling on the stove as Daniel stirred it with a wooden spoon. He tried to hum while he worked, some half-remembered tune that once filled the kitchen when life was lighter, but the sound kept catching in his throat. The pasta water hissed behind him, steam fogging the chipped cabinet doors. He forced a grin as he turned to face the table, where Maria sat quietly, her elbows resting on the worn laminate surface, chin propped against her hand. She didn't say anything, but her eyes followed every movement. She noticed the way his hand shook when he lifted the spoon, how his shoulders slumped as though gravity had grown heavier in the span of a single day. Sophie sat between them, legs swinging beneath her chair, crayons scattered across the table like a burst of color against the muted backdrop of their modest home. She pressed one purple crayon so hard against her coloring book that the paper tore. She frowned, then glanced up at her father. Her brow furrowed, the way children's brows do when they notice something adults hope they don't. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his sleeve quickly, too quickly, as though it were just steam or sweat. Maria noticed. Sophie noticed too. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice so small it might have been mistaken for the hum of the refrigerator. "Why is Daddy crying?" The words landed heavier than anything Daniel had carried out of his office that day. He froze, spoon hovering in midair. He thought he'd hidden it, thought he'd carried his grief like a secret in the lining of his coat. He turned his face away toward the stove, but the tremble in his shoulders betrayed him. Maria reached across the table and gently took Sophie's hand, squeezing it once, her voice steady. "Daddy's just remembering something, sweetheart," she said softly. Her eyes lingered on Daniel's back as she spoke, a silent plea for him to hold himself together just a little longer. But Sophie wasn't satisfied with that answer. She slid down from her chair, bare feet padding softly against the linoleum, and crossed the small space between them. Daniel tried to laugh as he twirled the spaghetti, tried to pretend everything was fine, but then her tiny hand tugged at his pant leg. He looked down, and she was climbing onto his lap, determined. She turned his face toward hers with a gentleness that felt older than her 5 years, and her small palm pressed against his cheek. His mask broke. His eyes brimmed with a grief he couldn't hide any more. "Don't cry, Daddy," Sophie said, her voice trembling with the seriousness only a child can give to such a promise. She held up her coloring book, flipped to a page she had filled with uneven scribbled stars, blue, yellow, green, every shade she could find. "I'll give you my stars." The air left his lungs in a shudder. He looked at the page, clumsy drawings crowded across the paper, and yet to him they were galaxies, entire constellations of love offered freely. Something inside him cracked open, something he'd been trying to hold shut since the moment the HR manager slid that paper across the desk. Maria stood quietly, watching, her own throat tight. She had seen Daniel strong through deployments, layoffs, hospital bills, every storm that life hurled at them, but this was different. This was the moment he couldn't disguise himself anymore. And maybe, she thought, he didn't need to. Daniel pulled Sophie close, her small head tucked against his chest. He kissed her hair, and his voice came out rough, unsteady. "Thank you, sweet pea." His hands shook as they wrapped around her, but this time he didn't hide it. He let himself cry, silently, into the crown of her hair, while she clutched the coloring book tight between them like a shield against everything outside their little kitchen. The sauce hissed. The pasta boiled over, but none of them moved to fix it. For once, the world could wait. In that small apartment, in that fragile moment, they let the truth hang unvarnished in the air. Daddy was crying, Mommy was watching, and a little girl's stars were the only thing keeping the night from collapsing entirely. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above the warehouse floor, a sound Daniel had grown used to over 15 years, though now it grated like static. His locker door creaked open, the paint chipped from years of use, and he began placing the remnants of his career into a cardboard box. A wrench he'd borrowed years ago and never returned. A small thermos with dents that told its own story of late nights and early mornings. A photo taped inside the door, Sophie in her Halloween costume, dressed as a star because she'd insisted princesses were too obvious. He peeled it off carefully, folding the edges so it wouldn't tear. The echo of footsteps down the hall reminded him he wasn't supposed to linger. He was no longer part of this world, and yet he couldn't bring himself to leave it entirely behind. Rumors swirled like storm clouds through Whitaker Logistics. The new boss was arriving today, Cassandra Vale, a name whispered in break rooms with the same tone one might use for a hurricane's approach. Young, brilliant, ruthless. A Wall Street darling turned executioner, famous for salvaging sinking ships by cutting out the crew. Employees traded nervous glances, half dreading, half curious. "She's a shark," one whispered. "Doesn't blink when she fires entire floors." "She's got no heart," another muttered. "A machine in heels." Daniel listened quietly as he sorted through his things, though he wasn't supposed to care anymore. He heard it before he saw it, the change in air, the shift in voices, the sudden hush that rippled down the corridor. Footsteps, steady, deliberate, heels striking the polished floor with the certainty of someone who expected rooms to obey before she even opened her mouth. Daniel turned his head just slightly, enough to catch a glimpse as she entered the building. She was immaculate, dark tailored suit that cut sharp lines across her frame, a blouse so white it seemed to repel the dingy light of the warehouse. Her hair pulled back in a severe twist, every strand disciplined, eyes like searchlights, scanning, assessing, dismissing, in the space of a breath. She walked with the kind of posture that announced control long before words were spoken. People shifted, straightened, lowered their voices. Even the air seemed to move differently around her. Daniel should have looked away, but he didn't. For one fraction of a second, their eyes met. It wasn't long enough for recognition, not long enough for judgment, but long enough for him to notice what most others wouldn't. Beneath the polish, beneath the steel, there was something else. Not weakness, not exactly, but weariness. Exhaustion sheathed in armor. A loneliness so carefully hidden it looked like confidence, unless you stared too closely. The connection startled him. He dropped his gaze quickly, tucking Sophie's photo into the folds of his coat. He ducked back into the row of lockers, out of sight, clutching the cardboard box like a shield. His pulse hammered. He wasn't supposed to be here when she arrived, wasn't supposed to witness this changing of the guard. He told himself she hadn't noticed him, just another shadow in a place already half forgotten. He slipped toward the side exit, keeping his head down, hoping to vanish as quietly as he'd arrived. But as he pushed through the metal door into the chill of the parking lot, he couldn't shake the sensation that her gaze had lingered a second too long. That maybe, just maybe, the new queen of Whitaker Logistics had seen him after all. Not the janitor, not the casualty of downsizing, but a man carrying a box filled with fragments of a life she had never lived, fragments she might secretly recognize. He shook the thought off and kept walking, though the echo of her heels still followed him in his mind like a rhythm he couldn't forget. The break room was quieter than Daniel remembered, stripped of the usual hum of conversation and clatter of microwaves. The vending machine buzzed faintly in the corner, but even that sound felt out of place, as if mocking the silence. He lowered himself into one of the plastic chairs, the kind that always wobbled on uneven legs, and set the small cardboard box at his feet. He had told himself this trip was just about logistics, collect the last of his belongings, hand in the key card, walk out without looking back. But as soon as he sat down, the weight of it all broke past the thin walls he'd built. His hands covered his face, and before he could stop it, the tears came hot and unrelenting. For 15 years, this room had been his refuge. Countless lunches eaten in solitude, countless nights when overtime left him reheating leftovers under flickering fluorescent lights. It wasn't much, but it had been steady, predictable, a place he could lean on. Now, sitting there for the final time, he felt like he was mourning not just a job, but an entire life that had been taken apart in the space of a single meeting. His shoulders shook, his breaths coming shallow, and he pressed his palms harder into his eyes as though pressure could hide the sound. He didn't hear the footsteps, he didn't hear the faint squeak of sneakers against tile, until a small voice broke the silence wide open. "Mommy, why is Daddy crying?" The words echoed against the sterile walls, innocent and piercing all at once. Daniel's chest seized. He dropped his hands too quickly, blinking through the blur. And there she was, Sophie, clutching her coloring book against her chest, blonde hair tumbling from its braid. Maria stood behind her, one hand still on the door, eyes widening at the sight of him undone. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. He wanted to reassure, to laugh it off, to spin some story about dust in his eye or a long yawn, but Sophie's gaze was steady, too wise for her years, and Maria's hand tightened gently on her shoulder as though trying to shield her from the truth. "Daddy's just remembering something," Maria said softly, her voice carefully measured, the way you speak when balancing between comfort and honesty. Sophie frowned, not entirely convinced. She stepped forward, small shoes tapping against the tile, and before Daniel could gather himself, she was climbing onto his lap. Her coloring book slid open, pages fluttering, until it landed on one filled with scribbled stars. She pressed it toward him with all the gravity of a gift. "Don't cry, Daddy," she whispered, her little hand resting on his damp cheek. "I'll give you my stars." The air in the room shifted. Daniel's throat tightened until he could barely breathe. The page was a chaos of colors, stars of every size and shade, uneven and crooked, but to him it looked like the night sky itself, a galaxy drawn by the only person who believed he still hung among them. His arms wrapped around her, holding her close, clinging to the fragile lifeline she didn't even realize she had thrown him. Neither of them knew they weren't alone. Just outside the doorway, Cassandra Vale stood frozen, one hand pressed against the frame, her knuckles white. She had been on her way to the warehouse floor, already drafting mental notes about restructuring, about efficiency metrics and headcount reductions, but the sound of Sophie's voice had stopped her cold. She couldn't see everything, but she heard it. Heard the child's question ring out like a bell, heard the silence that followed, heard the tremor in Maria's voice as she tried to shield her daughter from a truth too heavy for 5-year-old shoulders. Cassandra's gaze lingered on the floor, jaw tight, breath caught somewhere between her ribs. Her reputation was built on never hesitating, never letting humanity get in the way of profit. Yet in that moment, with one man's brokenness laid bare in a deserted break room, she felt the armor she had worn for years bend under the weight of a child's words. She could have walked away. She should have. Instead, she stood there longer than she meant to, listening to a family hold itself together with nothing but stars scribbled in crayon, and when she finally pulled her hand from the doorframe, her fingers trembled like they hadn't in years. The elevator doors slid shut with a metallic sigh, sealing Cassandra Vale in her private box of glass and steel as it carried her upward. She stood perfectly still, arms crossed, chin high, the picture of composure, but her reflection in the mirrored panel betrayed the faintest tremor in her jaw. She should have brushed it off. She'd overheard hundreds of breakdowns in her career, employees crying in stairwells, whispers about mortgages and medical bills. None of it mattered. None of it was supposed to matter. But Sophie's voice clung to her like smoke in her lungs, inescapable. "Mommy, why is Daddy crying?" the words replayed over and over until the walls themselves seemed to whisper them. By the time the elevator opened into the top floor, her office, a space designed to intimidate more than comfort, felt heavier than usual. The skyline stretched out in a panorama of glass towers and blinking lights, each one a monument to the battles she had already won. Once, standing here filled her with a pulse of triumph, a reminder of how far she'd risen. Tonight, it only reminded her of how far she'd run. She set her bag down on the mahogany desk, slipped off her heels, and sank into the leather chair. The silence was deafening. She pressed her palms together tightly, willing the thought away. But the memory came unbidden, as if some part of her had been waiting for this very moment to claw its way to the surface. She was 12 years old again, standing in the kitchen of a house that smelled of stale coffee and overdue bills. Her father sat slumped at the table, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Her mother, brittle and furious, slammed a cupboard shut so hard the plates rattled. "Stop it," she hissed. "You're scaring her." And Cassandra, a skinny girl with scraped knees, had whispered, "Mommy, why is Daddy crying?" Her mother's silence was the answer. It was that night Cassandra made herself a promise. She would never cry where anyone could see. She would never be weak enough to beg, never be small enough to need saving. She built herself on that vow, one brick of determination after another, until nothing could touch her, or so she believed. But today, in a dingy break room she had no reason to enter, she had seen the same picture replayed. Another man, his life carved apart by forces beyond him, undone in front of his child. She had expected pity, maybe annoyance. What she felt instead was recognition. A crack in her carefully constructed armor, one she couldn't ignore. Daniel Whitaker was nothing special in the corporate world, middle-aged, ordinary, easily replaced. She had made a career out of cutting men like him loose without a second glance. Yet the look on his face as he held his daughter's crayon-covered stars clung to her more tightly than any deal she'd ever closed. He hadn't asked for mercy. He hadn't asked for anything at all. And somehow that haunted her more. She reached for her phone, thumb hovering over the screen where her evening calendar glared back. Dinner with investors, strategy session with legal, calls stacked until midnight. A life plan to the second, a fortress of obligations that left no room for weakness. Her finger moved almost of its own accord. One by one she canceled them all. A chorus of alert tones chimed in protest. But she silenced the device, set it face down, and leaned back into her chair. The office lights glowed faintly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but outside the city glittered like a field of restless stars. For years, she had believed this skyline was hers, conquered, bent beneath her will. Tonight, staring at it from behind the glass, she saw something else entirely. The towers looked fragile, temporary, like toys waiting to topple, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself sit in the quiet without agenda, without armor. Her chest rose and fell slowly, as though relearning how to breathe. Sophie's voice lingered still, softer now but insistent, echoing across decades of silence. "Why is Daddy crying?" Cassandra pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. She didn't have the answer, not for Sophie, not for herself. For the first time in years, she allowed the silence to remain unanswered. The call came in the middle of the afternoon, when Daniel was hunched over the kitchen table with a stack of unpaid bills spread like playing cards in front of him. The number on the screen flashed unfamiliar, corporate. For a second he thought it might be a mistake, some automated reminder of benefits he no longer had. He answered anyway, his voice low, cautious. "Mr. Whitaker, this is Human Resources at Whitaker Logistics. We need you to come in tomorrow morning. Ms. Vale would like to conduct your exit interview personally." Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Ms. Vale, the CEO?" "That's correct," the voice on the other end confirmed, clipped, efficient. 10 a.m. sharp. The line went dead before he could ask the question spilling into his mind. He sat there staring at the phone, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. 15 years he'd worked there, and not once had anyone above middle management so much as spoken his name. Now, after being discarded, after walking out with a cardboard box like every other casualty, the new queen of the company wanted to see him? When Maria came in from the bedroom, she found him still staring at the phone like it had delivered a prophecy. "What is it?" she asked, sliding her sweater tighter around her frame. "They want me back tomorrow," he said slowly. "Cassandra Vale herself wants to do my exit interview." Maria stopped, frowning as though she hadn't understood him. "That doesn't make sense." "CEOs don't do exit interviews." "I know." Her expression softened into worry. She crossed the room and set a hand on his shoulder. "Danny, don't read into it. She's not here to save you. She's not going to hand you your job back." "I'm not asking her to," he murmured. "But you're hoping." He didn't answer. Maria crouched down so she could look him in the eye. "You have to protect yourself. Don't let her play with you like this. You're already hurting. Don't give her more ways to take from you." He reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly, but his gaze drifted past her to Sophie's drawing still taped to the fridge, those crooked stars she'd gifted him as armor against nights like this. Something stirred in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, not faith in miracles, something smaller, steadier, dignity. "I don't think this is about getting my job back," he said finally, "but maybe it's a chance to say something, to speak like a man, not just the guy with a mop. If she listens, even for a second, maybe it means I didn't disappear completely." Maria studied him, her eyes tired but soft. "And if she doesn't? Then I'll walk out knowing I said what needed to be said." Later that night, as Sophie slept in the next room, Daniel sat by the window with his old leather-bound notebook in his lap. He flipped through pages of scribbled thoughts, half-finished melodies, reminders of the man he used to be before survival became his only skill. His reflection in the glass was faint, but for once he didn't see a ghost. He saw someone on the edge of remembering himself. Sleep came late. He dreamt of hallways, of doors closing, of voices he couldn't quite reach. But in the morning, when he rose and pulled on his jacket, there was a steadiness in his step that hadn't been there the day before. Maria kissed his cheek as he left, whispering again, "She's not here to save you." He nodded, his hand brushing over Sophie's drawing folded in his pocket. "I know," he whispered back. As he stepped into the sharp air of morning, he realized this wasn't about salvation at all. It was about standing tall, even if only for a moment, in front of the woman who represented everything that had broken him. And for the first time in weeks, the thought didn't frighten him. It steadied him. He was ready to walk back through those glass doors, not as an employee begging for scraps, but as a man with something left to say. The receptionist had barely spoken to him when she led him down the hushed corridor, heels clicking against polished stone. Every step felt like a reminder of where he did not belong. The door opened soundlessly, and Daniel stepped inside. Cassandra Vale's office was less a room than a statement, a glass box suspended high above the city, designed so anyone standing within its walls would feel the weight of the skyline pressing down, reminding them of their smallness. Daniel clutched the strap of his worn jacket tighter over his shoulder. He expected her to be perched like royalty behind the massive desk, a queen in her court. Instead, Cassandra Vale was standing by the window, her reflection faint in the glass, arms folded across herself as though she needed something to hold on to. She turned when he entered. For a moment he thought she looked younger than the rumors, younger and far less invincible. "Mr. Whitaker," she began. Her voice was smooth, deliberate, but underneath it was something frayed. "Thank you for coming in." He nodded once, wary. His throat felt tight, and he wasn't sure if he should speak. He waited for the performance he knew was coming, the rehearsed apology, the corporate platitude wrapped in polished steel. But she didn't launch into a speech. She stepped closer instead, her eyes steady, but carrying a weight that made his stomach churn. "I overheard yesterday," she said. The pause lingered, thick with unspoken things. Daniel's chest stiffened. The break room. Sophie's voice. The moment he'd thought was private, stripped bare in front of the two people who mattered most. Now he realized it hadn't been private at all. He braced himself for humiliation, for her to wield his weakness like a blade. But what she said instead knocked the breath from him. "What do you tell a child," she asked quietly, "when they see you fall apart?" Her voice wasn't mocking. It wasn't cold, it was raw, so unexpected that for a second he thought he'd misheard. The city stretched endlessly behind her, towers and glass. But in that moment it seemed she wasn't speaking as a CEO. She was speaking as something far more dangerous, a person. Daniel swallowed hard. His voice came rough, uneven. "You don't," he said. "You don't tell them anything. You just try to stand up again, even if your legs don't want to." Cassandra leaned back slightly, the faintest shift in her posture, and for the first time her mask cracked. Not completely, but enough for him to see something flicker across her face. Not pity, not judgment, recognition. She moved to her desk, setting her hands flat on the surface as though she needed the stability. Her gaze flicked to him again, sharper now, but tinged with something more vulnerable. "I grew up watching my father lose everything," she said. "Every day he came home smaller. Every day my mother's voice got louder, and I swore I would never—" She stopped, the words collapsing before they reached their end. She shook her head once, sharply, as though pulling the mask back into place. Daniel didn't reply. He stood quietly, the cardboard box of his belongings still at his feet, his hands folded in front of him. He realized she hadn't invited him here to explain his termination. She had invited him here because somehow his collapse had reached her, touched a bruise she'd buried so deep it had hardened into armor. For a long moment silence filled the office. Outside, the city glittered with the illusion of control, but inside two people stood in the fragile space where truth had slipped through. Finally, Cassandra exhaled, slow and steady. "Thank you for being honest," she said. Daniel nodded. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. For the first time, it felt like he wasn't invisible. And though nothing about his life had changed, something inside him had shifted. He had spoken, and she had listened. And in a world that so often demanded silence, that was its own kind of victory. The apartment smelled faintly of soap and simmering rice when Daniel pushed open the door that evening. His steps were slower than usual, each one weighted with the kind of exhaustion that went beyond muscle. He dropped his jacket on the chair and lingered in the entryway, not sure how to carry the strangeness of the day inside with him. The conversation with Cassandra Vale had left him with more questions than answers, more shadows than clarity. He had expected judgment, maybe dismissal, but instead he'd walked away with something harder to name, something that felt like a wound reopening and a door unlocking at the same time. Before he could set his thoughts in order, small feet pattered across the floor. Sophie barreled toward him, holding a sheet of paper clutched tight in both hands. "Daddy!" she cried, her face bright with pride. "Look what I made!" She thrust the paper into his chest, nearly wrinkling it with her enthusiasm. Daniel crouched down, his hands trembling as he took the drawing. Crayon lines sprawled across the page, bold and crooked, but full of intention. 3 figures holding hands, himself, Maria, and Sophie, standing in front of a tall building with windows drawn like little squares stacked on top of each other. Above the scene, written in shaky, uneven letters, were the words, "Daddy's Work." His throat tightened. He stared at the drawing longer than he meant to, tracing every imperfect star Sophie had scattered across the sky around the building. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens in yellows and blues, and even a streak of green filling the space until the page looked alive. Stars surrounding a building, protecting it, as though she believed it belonged to him, as though she believed he belonged to it still. Maria leaned against the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a towel. She watched quietly, her eyes following the way Daniel's shoulders slumped as he held the drawing. "How did it go?" she asked softly, careful not to let the question press too hard. Daniel didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes fixed on the paper, unable to let go of the vision his daughter had placed in his hands. He thought about Cassandra's question, "What do you tell a child when they see you fall apart?" And the truth he'd offered her, "You don't. You just stand up again." Looking at Sophie's stars, he wondered if maybe that was what she was asking of him now. Not words, not explanations, just the strength to rise, even after being cut down. Finally he exhaled, his voice quiet. "Different," he said, though the word carried little meaning. Maria stepped closer, laying a hand on his shoulder. "Different how?" He shook his head, unable to explain the way Cassandra had looked at him, not as an expendable employee, but as someone carrying a weight she recognized. He didn't know what it meant yet, didn't trust it fully, but it had shifted something inside him. He wasn't ready to speak it aloud, not even to Maria. Instead, he lifted the paper again, his voice breaking just slightly. "She drew us in front of the building," he whispered. Maria's eyes softened. "Because she thinks it's still part of you." Daniel swallowed hard, brushing his thumb across the waxy crayon lines. He wanted to believe it. For weeks he had seen himself as discarded, erased, a man defined only by loss. But his daughter's stars told a different story. To her he wasn't gone. To her he was still standing, still shining, even if only in crooked lines on a page. He pulled Sophie close, holding her small frame against his chest, the drawing pressed between them like a fragile truth. She giggled, oblivious to the way her father's eyes stung. "Do you like it?" she asked. "I love it," he said, voice thick. And he meant it more than she could know. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Daniel sat at the table with the drawing propped against the salt shaker, the stars catching the dim kitchen light. He stared at it until the lines blurred, until the heaviness in his chest began to shift. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something he couldn't yet see. The penthouse was silent except for the faint hum of the city below, a sound that usually soothed Cassandra, reminding her of her height, her distance, her victory. Tonight, the hum felt hollow, like static against glass. She stood barefoot in her living room, hair loosened from its immaculate twist, suit jacket draped carelessly across the back of a chair. In her hand she held a glass of wine, the dark liquid catching the reflection of the skyline. She lifted it halfway, paused, and set it back down untouched. The window before her was a mirror now, black with night, her own face staring back at her. Strong jawline, perfectly drawn brows, a face people described as regal, but she didn't see a queen in that reflection. She saw a woman who had built walls so high she couldn't remember what was on the other side. Her lips trembled once, barely noticeable, and she pressed them into a line. For years she had told herself the same lie. Tears were weakness. Tears were what made her father small, what made her mother bitter, what turned their house into a graveyard of broken pride. Her father had cried silently at the kitchen table after the plant closed, and each tear had made him seem less like a man in her young eyes. Her mother, sharp-tongued and resentful, had mocked him for it, then cried behind closed doors when she thought no one could hear. Cassandra had listened through the thin walls, swearing to herself she would never end up like either of them, never broken, never begging, never on her knees. But as she stood staring into her own reflection now, she felt a chill crawl across her skin. Maybe it wasn't tears that destroyed them. Maybe it was the silence afterward. Maybe it was the refusal to speak what hurt, the refusal to let someone else see the wound. Maybe it was the absence of tears, the absence of release that had turned her mother into stone and her father into a ghost. She swallowed, her throat tight. Sophie's voice came back to her, piercing through the polished armor she had spent decades forging. "Mommy, why is Daddy crying?" That single question had echoed in her skull all day, refusing to fade. It wasn't just the words, it was the purity of them, the way a child had asked what no adult dared to ask. Why do we break? Why do we pretend we don't? Cassandra had seen the man's face, Daniel, his name was, and the devastation there was undeniable. But instead of disgust, instead of judgment, she had felt something else. Recognition. She gripped the edge of the counter, leaning forward as if bracing herself against a wave. For 15 years she had sharpened herself into a weapon, a woman who cut clean, who never faltered, who never apologized. Investors trusted her ruthlessness. Boards admired her efficiency. Employees feared her. All of it proof she was winning, proof she was nothing like the girl from that broken kitchen table. But Sophie's question had pierced her armor like no boardroom ever could. "Why is Daddy crying?" She whispered the words aloud now, testing them on her tongue. Her voice cracked on the last syllable. She hated the sound of it. She hated the way her chest seized. And yet she couldn't stop saying it in her head, couldn't stop replaying the look in Daniel's eyes when he held his daughter's stars as if they were salvation. Her wineglass sat untouched on the counter, condensation sliding down its side. She pressed her fingers to the glass, then drew them back as if burned. For the first time in years, she admitted to herself she wasn't untouchable. She wasn't invincible. She was tired. So tired she didn't know how long she'd been holding her breath. Her reflection in the window blurred as her eyes filled, though she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Not yet. Not tonight. But the pressure built behind her ribs, insistent. A storm, waiting. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, staring out at the glittering city she'd once believed she'd conquered. All those towers, all those lights, and yet she felt impossibly small. The silence in the penthouse pressed closer, a suffocating kind of quiet. Cassandra closed her eyes, and for a fleeting second she let herself imagine a different sound filling the room. Not the hum of the city, not the ticking of the clock, but the honest, unashamed sound of someone weeping. She didn't know if it was Daniel's, her father's, or her own. She stepped back from the window, her arms wrapping around herself. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel like a woman who had conquered anything. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of a truth she wasn't ready to face. The question lingered in the dark, unrelenting, breaking her down piece by piece. Why is Daddy crying? And though she had no answer, she knew the silence was no longer enough. The email landed in Daniel's inbox just after dawn, when the apartment was still quiet, and Sophie was humming to herself in her sleep down the hall. The subject line was stark, almost cold. "Miss Vale requests your presence tomorrow." No explanation, no apology, just the weight of her name and the insistence of her authority. Daniel stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen, before setting the phone down as though it might burn him. Maria was pouring coffee when he told her. She froze, mug in hand, eyes narrowing in suspicion. "No," she said immediately. "Danny, no." "You're not going back there." "It's not my old job," he said quietly. "It's something else." "Something else?" Her voice sharpened. "She fired you. She stripped you of 15 years without a second thought, and now she snaps her fingers. And you come running? Don't do this to yourself." Daniel rubbed a hand across his face, weariness pressing deep into his bones. "Maybe I just want to hear what she has to say. That's all." Maria set the mug down harder than she meant to, the ceramic clink sharp against the counter. "She's not here to save you, Danny." "I know," he whispered. But the truth was, some part of him felt a pull he couldn't explain. Maybe dignity, maybe curiosity. Or maybe it was simply that Cassandra Vale had seen him when no one else had, and he wanted to understand why. The next morning he walked through the glass doors again, the same lobby that had once exiled him, now swallowing him in silence. The receptionist's tone was different this time, respectful almost as she directed him to the top floor. His palms were damp, but his step was steady. He told himself he wasn't here to beg. Whatever this was, it wasn't about reclaiming what was lost. Her office was just as he remembered, expensive, gleaming, built to diminish anyone who entered. Yet when Cassandra rose from behind her desk, she didn't look like a conqueror. She looked human. The immaculate armor was still there, sharp suit, hair pulled back, but her eyes betrayed her. Tired, restless, uncertain. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming." He sat slowly, his cardboard box of belongings replaced by nothing but his folded hands. "I wasn't sure why you wanted me here." Cassandra hesitated. For someone known for her decisiveness, the pause was startling. She pressed her fingertips against the desk, her voice low but clear. "I can't give you back your old job. That door is closed." But she drew in a breath, as though gathering courage. "I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth. Someone who won't feed me what they think I want to hear. Come work for me directly. Advisor, consultant, name your hours." Daniel blinked, his mind stalling. For a moment he wondered if this was some kind of test, a trick meant to expose him. "Why me?" he asked finally, his voice tight. Her gaze faltered. For the first time she looked away, the city skyline filling the silence between them. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note he'd never expected to hear, almost shame. "Because you remind me of what I lost chasing this title." The words hung heavy, charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Daniel studied her, this woman who commanded boardrooms and headlines, now confessing something raw across a desk meant to keep others at a distance. He saw the steel, yes, but also the crack running through it. He leaned back slowly, the weight of the offer pressing against him. It wasn't salvation. It wasn't charity. It was something stranger, more fragile, a bridge between two people who had both lost too much, pretending they couldn't. And though part of him wanted to walk away, another part whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. The offer followed Daniel home like a shadow, heavier with each step up the apartment stairs. He carried it inside without saying a word, hanging his coat on the peg and pausing, as though the act of crossing the threshold required more courage than it should. The smell of tomato and basil lingered in the air. Maria had been cooking, though the pot now sat cold on the stove. She was waiting for him at the table, arms crossed, her posture already speaking the words he dreaded to hear. He told her everything, the email, the meeting. Cassandra's voice, steady but trembling beneath the edges as she asked him to stand beside her, not as an employee, not as a subordinate, but as someone who could speak the truth no one else dared to. He repeated her exact words, unable to shake them even if he wanted to, "Because you remind me of what I lost chasing this title." Maria's face darkened with every detail. She leaned back, shaking her head slowly. "Why trust her?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. "She already took everything from you." 15 years, Danny, 15 years, and she cut you down without blinking. And now what? She gets to sweep in like some savior because she feels guilty? Daniel lowered his eyes, his hands clasped together on the table. He wanted to argue, wanted to say the things burning in his chest, but the words came out softer than he intended. What if she's not taking this time? What if she's giving something back? Maria stared at him, stunned. Giving what back? Your pride? Our stability? None of this makes sense. You think she cares about us? About Sophie? I don't know, he admitted, his voice catching. But when she spoke, it wasn't a CEO talking. It was... He hesitated, struggling to find the word. It was someone who knows what it feels like to lose. Maria opened her mouth to respond, but a small voice interrupted them. Sophie, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her crayons spread around her like a rainbow, looked up from the page she was coloring. She tilted her head, her blonde hair falling into her eyes. "Daddy," she said carefully, as though she'd been listening the whole time. "If she's sad, maybe you can help her smile." The room went still. Daniel turned toward his daughter, his chest tightening at the innocence in her words. To Sophie, it was simple. If someone was sad, you tried to help. She didn't see the politics, the betrayals, the scars. She just saw a person hurting. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell her it wasn't that easy. But instead he felt something break open inside him. He held her words as though they were fragile, precious, a truth too pure to deny. Maria watched him, her expression softening but not surrendering. She's 5, Danny. She doesn't understand. Maybe she understands better than we do, he murmured, still staring at Sophie's coloring book. On the page she was sketching another family scene, this time the 3 of them beneath a sky filled with stars. He noticed she'd added a 4th figure, just a faint outline, standing slightly apart, as though unsure if they belonged. His throat tightened. For the first time since the layoff, he felt the weight of survival shift. He'd been moving through each day like a man underwater, desperate only to keep breathing, to keep the bills paid, to keep food on the table. But Sophie's words lingered like a light breaking through the surface. What if life was more than surviving? What if it was about rebuilding, not the same way as before, but differently, stronger, with meaning he'd forgotten he was allowed to have? He looked at Maria, his eyes tired but steady. I'm not saying I trust her. I don't know if I ever will, but maybe this isn't about her. Maybe it's about me, about proving to myself I'm not finished yet. Maria held his gaze for a long time, torn between fear and something else. Finally, she looked away, her hands tightening on the dish towel in her lap. She didn't agree, but she didn't argue further either. Sophie, oblivious to the storm between her parents, added bright yellow stars to her drawing, humming softly. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching her, feeling something flicker in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. Not certainty, not security, but possibility. For the first time, he let himself imagine a future that wasn't about clawing to survive. A future that could be built again, piece by piece, even if it looked nothing like the past. The first days were awkward. Daniel wasn't sure if he was supposed to walk a step behind Cassandra Vale like an assistant, or beside her like an equal. She didn't clarify, and maybe that was the point. He moved with her through polished corridors and glass-walled boardrooms, watching as she commanded rooms with little more than a glance. Executives leaned forward when she spoke. Investors scribbled her words like gospel. But in the spaces between meetings, when the doors closed and the noise dropped away, she would go quiet in a way that felt less like rest and more like retreat. Daniel wasn't dazzled by her power. He had seen enough in his life to know that power was just another costume. What disarmed him was her silence. She didn't need another voice echoing her own. She already had 100 people willing to say yes. What she seemed to need, though she would never admit it, was someone who noticed what she left unsaid. During one endless afternoon, when the board droned on about projections and restructuring charts, Cassandra sat with her jaw clenched, her pen tapping against the leather folder in front of her. Daniel leaned closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Breathe." Her pen froze. She turned to look at him, startled, as though he'd caught her forgetting something as basic as air. For a second she looked ready to snap, but then her shoulders loosened, her chest rising with a deeper breath than she'd taken all hour. She said nothing, but when the meeting ended, she didn't leave right away. She lingered by the door, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The next day he asked why she never stepped into the employee cafeteria. He had noticed how she always took her meals in her office or skipped them altogether. She stiffened instantly, her eyes flashing. "Because I don't have time to eat among gossip." He tilted his head, unbothered by her edge. "Or is it because you're afraid they'll see you're just like them?" Her eyes narrowed, sharp as glass, the retort forming on her tongue, but then, almost imperceptibly, it dissolved. She looked away toward the skyline, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. "If they see me as human, they'll stop believing in the myth, and the myth is what keeps this place moving." Daniel studied her for a moment, then spoke gently. Sometimes being human is the only way people will follow you. Otherwise, they're just following the mask. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. She turned back to him slowly, something shifting in her gaze. Not surrender, not yet, but recognition. As if she'd heard the echo of her own fear spoken aloud and realized it wasn't invincible, after all. Over the weeks that followed, their rhythm found a strange balance. She moved fast, decisive, slicing through problems like a blade. He stayed steady, noticing the edges she skimmed past, the questions she didn't want to ask. In meetings, she spoke with precision, but afterward he asked what she hadn't said, and sometimes she answered. Other times, she just looked at him like he was the first person to see her in years. Daniel wasn't sure what this was becoming. He wasn't sure if she knew either, but one thing was clear. She didn't need him to save her. She needed him to remind her she was still human, that the mask could crack and the world wouldn't collapse. And as he walked beside her through those corridors of glass and steel, he realized he was learning too, learning that even the people who looked untouchable could carry shadows just as heavy as his own. The park was nearly empty that afternoon, the kind of weekday lull when the world seemed to exhale. Daniel sat on a worn bench with Sophie perched beside him, their simple lunch spread out between them. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a thermos of lemonade, a bag of apple slices Sophie had insisted on packing herself. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and sun-warmed asphalt. For the first time in days, Daniel felt something close to peace, until the sound of heels on pavement reached his ears. He looked up, surprised. Cassandra Vale stood at the edge of the path, dressed not in the immaculate armor of her boardroom, but in something softer, though no less deliberate. A cream blouse, dark slacks, sunglasses that failed to hide the uncertainty in her posture. She looked out of place, as though she'd stepped into a world she wasn't sure how to belong to. "Miss Vale," Daniel said cautiously, rising halfway. She raised a hand, almost sheepish. "Cassandra," she corrected. "May I?" Sophie blinked up at her with wide eyes. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Cassandra sat down on the bench, the leather of her bag creaking as she set it aside. The silence stretched awkwardly until Sophie leaned over, rifled through her backpack, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She smoothed it on her lap before holding it out. "This is for you," she said. Cassandra unfolded it slowly, as if afraid it might break. Crayon lines filled the page. A tall figure with sharp shoulders, unmistakably her, drawn in bright colors. Above the figure, Sophie had scrawled stars, dozens of them, yellow and blue, crowding the sky. Cassandra's breath caught. "Is that me?" Sophie nodded. "I put stars over your head," she explained matter-of-factly, "because you look lonely." The words landed with a weight Cassandra hadn't felt in years. For a second she couldn't speak. Then, unexpectedly, laughter bubbled out of her. Light, startled, unfamiliar. The sound felt rusty, as though it had been locked away for too long. Daniel turned to look at her, startled by it too. But when the laugh faded, her eyes glistened. She blinked quickly, brushing at the corner of her lashes before either of them could notice. Sophie didn't see. She was already pointing toward the swings at the far end of the playground. "Daddy, can I go?" "Of course," Daniel said gently. Sophie bolted off, her ponytail bouncing as she ran, leaving Cassandra still clutching the drawing. She stared at it for a long time, her thumb brushing the waxy crayon lines. "Children don't lie," she murmured, almost to herself. Daniel studied her carefully. She didn't mean it unkindly. "I know," Cassandra said quickly, her voice rougher than she intended. She let out a slow breath. "That's what makes it harder." Daniel leaned back on the bench, watching Sophie pump her legs on the swing until she soared higher and higher. She sees people for what they are, not their masks. Cassandra folded the drawing carefully, slipping it into her bag like a fragile artifact. Her voice dropped, quiet but certain. "Do you know the last time someone gave me something without expecting anything in return?" Daniel shook his head. Neither do I, she admitted. Sophie squealed from the swings, calling for her father to watch her fly. Daniel raised a hand in acknowledgement, his eyes warm. Cassandra followed his gaze, something shifting in her chest. She had spent years chasing applause, headlines, respect. And here, in a simple park with the sun filtering through the trees, a 5-year-old had handed her something no boardroom had ever given: grace. For the first time in years, Cassandra Vale allowed herself to sit in the quiet, not as a CEO, not as an untouchable figure, but as a woman holding a crayon drawing of herself surrounded by stars. And for the first time she didn't feel quite so alone. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, their crystals scattering light like fragments of stars. Waiters moved with practiced grace, silver trays balanced high, the soft clink of glasses punctuating the hum of conversation. Cassandra Vale stood near the stage, posture impeccable, her black gown a weapon as sharp as any boardroom suit. Around her, investors and shareholders orbited like satellites, their voices low and watchful, waiting for the moment she would step forward and deliver what she was famous for: control, precision, spin. Daniel lingered at the side of the room, half hidden near a column where the shadows pooled. He wasn't dressed for this world, not really, but Cassandra had insisted he come. He told himself he was there only to observe, to witness. But, truthfully, part of him wanted to see if she could do it, if she could peel back the armor even in front of those who demanded it most. The master of ceremonies introduced her with reverence, painting her as the savior of Whitaker Logistics, the visionary who had transformed near collapse into profit margins worth bragging about. Applause rippled through the room, though it carried more expectation than admiration. Cassandra stepped into the spotlight, her heels clicking once against the polished floor before she stilled. Flashes erupted the moment she faced the podium. Cameras. Reporters tucked discreetly among the crowd. The air tightened, a collective breath held. She began with the usual: numbers, projections, carefully chosen phrases that reassured without promising too much. But then came the question, sharp and inevitable, fired from a man with salt-gray hair and a voice like gravel. "What about the layoffs?" he asked, his tone laced with challenge. "What do you say to the hundreds of families cut adrift under your leadership? Wasn't this just ruthless efficiency?" The room stilled. Even the waiters froze mid-step. Everyone expected her to parry, to smooth the edges with rhetoric, to remind them that profit required sacrifice. Cassandra could recite that script in her sleep, but tonight she didn't. She let the silence linger, her fingers curled lightly against the podium. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but it carried a weight that made even the chandeliers seem to hush. "We cut too quickly," she said. Gasps broke the air like glass shattering. A few laughed nervously, thinking she was building toward some clever reversal. But she went on, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "We forgot that behind every role is a family. A father, a mother, a child who wonders why their parent comes home empty-handed. That was my failure." The reaction was immediate, fractured. A low murmur swelled as some frowned, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others applauded, tentative at first, then stronger, though uncertain whether such honesty was a strength or a weakness. The cameras flashed furiously, eager to capture the moment a woman known for her ruthless polish admitted to a flaw. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched. She stood in front of them, unshielded, her words unvarnished, and he knew how much it cost her. He could almost hear her voice from weeks earlier, confessing that if people saw her as human, they might stop believing in the myth. And now here she was, dismantling the myth herself. Cassandra didn't flinch at the divided response. She didn't try to reel the words back or bury them beneath jargon. She let them stand, raw and heavy in the glittering room. Her eyes swept the crowd once more, and for a moment she looked almost relieved. Daniel felt something stir inside him, a quiet pride. She had chosen honesty over armor, truth over the safety of distance, and though he knew the consequences could be brutal, stock prices dipping, investors whispering, He also knew this was the only way forward for her, for both of them. As the applause swelled again, this time more deliberate, Cassandra stepped back from the podium, her gaze flicking toward the edge of the room. For just a second, their eyes met. And in that brief exchange, Daniel understood. She hadn't been speaking only to them. She'd been speaking to herself, and she'd finally been heard. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. By morning, the headlines screamed her name in bold fonts, dissecting every word she had spoken at the gala. Vail cracks under pressure, weakness in the C-suite, the CEO who apologized. Television pundits leaned forward in their chairs, voices dripping with satisfaction as they called her unfit to lead. Investors whispered in urgent tones, their panic spilling into phone calls and boardrooms. And within the glass walls of Whitaker Logistics, rumors thickened like smoke. The board was already meeting in private, discussing the unthinkable, replacing Cassandra Vail. She sat in her office, blinds drawn against the skyline she once wore like a crown. Her laptop screen was littered with alerts, emails, messages, each one a reminder of how quickly the world could turn. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to drown out the static of voices calling for her downfall. For years she had thrived on storms like this, meeting them with sharpness, feeding off the fear she could generate. But this storm was different. This one reached past her armor, straight into the crack she had dared to show. When Daniel entered the office, she didn't look up right away. He closed the door softly behind him, the sound muted but deliberate, a boundary against the chaos outside. She finally lifted her head, her eyes rimmed red though she hadn't cried. Not yet. Her lips parted as though she wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't form. "They think I've destroyed everything," she whispered finally. Daniel stepped closer, his voice steady but gentle. "You told the truth. That doesn't destroy. It rebuilds." She shook her head, her laugh brittle. "You don't understand. They don't want truth. They want confidence, certainty. A figure they can project their own greed onto. I broke that illusion." Daniel studied her, the way her shoulders hunched as though the weight of the city itself pressed against them. He thought of Sophie, her little hand pressed to his cheek, whispering that she would give him her stars. And he thought of the question that had haunted him since, the question that had stripped him bare in the break room and somehow stitched him back together again. "When a child asks why Daddy's crying," he said softly, "the world should have an answer that isn't shame." Cassandra's eyes flicked to his, sharp at first, then breaking. He didn't stop. "You gave them one. You showed them that pain doesn't erase worth, that families aren't numbers, that honesty isn't weakness. You think you've lost control, but what you really did was give people permission to feel again." Her breath shuddered, and she looked away quickly, staring at the darkened glass of the window. "What if they don't forgive me?" "Then they don't," he replied simply. "But you'll still have spoken the truth. And that matters more than their applause." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city roared faintly outside, horns and sirens, the sound of a world that never stopped. Inside, the silence stretched, heavy but not empty. Cassandra's hands trembled on the edge of her desk, the mask she'd worn for years slipping further. She wasn't the woman who devoured weakness anymore. She was just a woman, human, frightened of falling. But this time she wasn't alone. Daniel moved closer, not touching her, but anchoring her with his presence. For weeks he had watched her carry herself like a fortress. Now he watched her bend under the storm and realized bending wasn't the same as breaking. She lifted her eyes to his once more, and in them was something new. Not the steel of command, not the fire of ambition, but trust. Fragile, hesitant, but real. Her nod was small, almost imperceptible, yet it was enough. The storm outside still raged, pundits shouting, investors panicking, the board sharpening their knives. But for the first time in her career, Cassandra Vail didn't face it with armor. She faced it with someone beside her, and though she trembled, she didn't stand alone. The apartment was dim that evening, the only light coming from the soft yellow lamp in the corner. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, loosening his tie, the fatigue of the day pulling at his shoulders. He hadn't told Maria much when he came in, just that the storm around Cassandra was growing louder, that he'd stayed late to help her weather it. Maria moved around the kitchen with clipped motions, setting plates down with more force than necessary. Silence pressed between them until finally she stopped, hands braced against the counter, her back to him. "Are you falling for her?" Her voice was raw, unsteady, like she hated the words even as she spoke them. Daniel's head snapped up, his chest tightening. For a moment he didn't know how to answer. Then he shook his head slowly, deliberately. "No," he said. His voice was low but certain. "I'm not falling for her. I'm helping her stand." Maria turned then, her eyes dark with doubt. "Do you hear yourself? You spend more time with her than you do with us. You defend her when the whole world is calling her weak. You look at her like—" She stopped, biting back the rest. Daniel pushed the words past the heaviness in his chest. "Like what?" "Like she matters," Maria whispered. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "She does matter. Not the way you think, not like that. Maria, I see a woman drowning in the same silence that almost broke me, and I can't just stand by and watch. I'm not falling for her. I'm making sure she doesn't disappear." Her jaw tightened, but the fight in her wavered. She searched his face, trying to read him, torn between fear that she might lose him and the faith she had carried through every storm before. The silence stretched so long it felt like it might swallow them whole. Then a small voice cut through it. "Daddy, Mommy, look!" Sophie padded into the room, clutching another drawing in her hands, crayon marks still fresh. She held it out proudly, the paper slightly smudged from her fingers. Daniel took it carefully, unfolding it on the table. 3 figures again, himself, Maria, and Sophie, but this time there was a fourth, Cassandra, drawn tall and sharp, but not above them, beside them. "She needs a friend too," Sophie said simply, her voice free of complication, her eyes shining with the unfiltered clarity only a child could offer. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Maria stared at the drawing, her breath leaving her in a long, uneven exhale. The tension in her shoulder softened, though not entirely. She reached out, brushing her fingertips lightly over the crayon stars Sophie had scattered above all their heads. "She needs a friend, too," Maria repeated quietly, almost to herself. She looked at Daniel then, really looked, and saw not a man straying, but a man holding another person steady, the way he had always done for her, for Sophie, for anyone who needed him. Daniel met her gaze, his voice rough with honesty. "You and Sophie are my home. That's never changed. But if helping her means reminding myself of who I am, then maybe that's part of us too." Maria closed her eyes briefly, then nodded, her breath trembling. "I don't have to like it," she murmured. "No," he said softly. "You just have to trust me." Sophie climbed onto his lap then, beaming as though she had solved something much bigger than the grown-ups ever could. Daniel kissed the top of her head, holding the drawing like a fragile truth. Maria sank into the chair across from him, weary but a little less afraid. And in the soft hum of that small apartment, with crayon stars lighting the page between them, the storm outside felt just a little further away. The announcement came with little warning. An email, stark and simple, dropped into inboxes across the company late the night before. Mandatory all-hands meeting, 9 a.m. main auditorium. No context, no agenda. Just a summons. By morning, whispers filled the hallways. Employees shuffled into the vast room with furrowed brows and folded arms, bracing themselves for another round of cuts, another layer of bad news disguised as strategy. Cassandra Vale stood at the front of the auditorium, her silhouette framed by the soft wash of stage lights. She wore no armor this time, no sharp red suit, no icy smile polished for shareholders, just a black blouse and a quiet determination that was harder to look away from than any performance she'd given before. She let the murmurs ripple through the room until they quieted on their own. Then she spoke. "I've asked you all here because I need to tell you something," she began, her voice steady but not cold. "We made mistakes." I made mistakes. The air shifted. Collective breaths caught. No one could remember the last time a leader had stood in that spot and spoken with such plainness. She went on, her words not rushed but deliberate. "We cut too deeply. We forgot that behind every number on a spreadsheet is a person, a family, a life. And for that, I take responsibility." Silence thickened. Cassandra scanned the crowd not with the sharp eyes of a strategist, but with something softer, searching. "So today, we begin something new. We're calling it the human promise." Screens flickered to life behind her, displaying 3 simple pillars: fewer cuts, more transparency, stronger support for families. She outlined each in turn. No more sudden layoffs with no warning. Open quarterly sessions where employees could ask questions without fear. Childcare stipends for working parents. Counseling services for those carrying too much alone. The room didn't erupt, not at first. People exchanged wary glances, suspicion woven into their surprise. But Cassandra didn't flinch. She wasn't asking for immediate forgiveness. She was offering something steadier. Then she said it. "To help guide this promise, I've asked someone who knows this company from the ground up to stand beside me. Someone who has spoken truth to me when no one else would. Please welcome Daniel Whitaker, our new advisor." Heads turned sharply. Murmurs swept the room. Daniel, sitting off to the side in his plain jacket, felt every eye burn into him. For a heartbeat, he considered shrinking back, retreating into the shadows where he'd lived for so long. But Cassandra's gaze found his across the stage, anchoring him. Slowly, he stood. The sight of him, once the man cleaning their floors, now stepping forward as the CEO's chosen counsel, stunned the room into silence. Then, almost tentatively, someone began to clap. Another followed, and then more, until the auditorium filled with the sound of hands striking together, not out of fear, not because they had to, but because something in them believed again. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the applause without basking in it. He wasn't here for celebration. He was here because honesty had brought him this far. And honesty would have to carry him further. He glanced at Cassandra, and she looked back, her expression unreadable but steady, as though the two of them were tethered by the same unspoken truth. Redemption isn't loud, it's steady. When the meeting ended, people lingered in clusters, voices low but different than before. There was curiosity, even a cautious hope. For the first time in years, the building didn't feel like a machine grinding its workers down. It felt like something alive, breathing again. Cassandra stepped off the stage, her heels clicking softly, but when she reached Daniel, she slowed. "They'll test us," she said quietly. "They should," Daniel replied. She let out a breath, a flicker of a smile ghosting her lips. "Then we begin." And together they walked out of the auditorium, not as CEO and advisor, not as myth and ghost, but as two people carrying the fragile beginnings of something worth keeping. The apartment had grown warmer in ways Daniel couldn't quite measure. Not just the heat from the old radiator rattling in the corner, or the lamplight pooling across the living room floor, but something gentler, steadier, that filled the air and softened the edges of the place. Months had passed since everything had turned upside down, the pink slip, the break room, the storm, and yet tonight, as Daniel moved through the familiar rooms, it felt like a different life altogether. Upstairs, Sophie was already tucked beneath her blankets, her hair splayed across the pillow in a golden halo. She clutched her stuffed rabbit against her chest, eyes wide and thoughtful. Daniel leaned down to smooth the blanket around her shoulders, the ritual familiar, sacred. She studied him with the same perceptive gaze she always had, the kind that saw straight through pretense. "Daddy," she asked softly, "why aren't you crying anymore?" The question pierced him in the gentlest way. Not like a wound, but like a key turning in a lock. He blinked, his throat tightening, then smiled. It wasn't the brittle kind he'd worn in those dark weeks after the layoff, but something softer, born of truth. Because sometimes, he said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, people listen. Sophie considered this, nodding slowly as if storing it away in the secret places of her heart. She kissed the rabbit on its head and whispered something Daniel didn't catch. Within minutes, her breathing steadied, eyes fluttering closed. He lingered by the doorway, watching her chest rise and fall, the innocence of sleep wrapping her in safety. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was standing guard over a fragile world. He felt like he was part of one. Downstairs, the quiet hum of conversation drifted from the kitchen. Maria was pouring tea into mismatched mugs, her movements unhurried, the tension that once lived in her shoulders long gone. Across from her, Cassandra sat at the table, not in her boardroom armor, but in a simple sweater, her hair loose around her face. She laughed quietly at something Maria said, the sound lighter than Daniel had ever imagined it could be. A notebook rested on the table beside her, its cover taped with Sophie's drawings. Stars, stick figures, and crayon-colored skies. Daniel stepped into the kitchen, drawn by the warmth radiating there. He slid into the chair beside them, and for a while they said nothing, just sat together in the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full. Cassandra traced a fingertip over one of Sophie's taped stars, her expression unreadable, yet softer than he'd ever seen. Maria handed Daniel a mug, her fingers brushing his, her eyes steady and sure. It struck him then, family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about choosing to stay, to carry one another through storms, to share stars when the sky felt too dark. Cassandra had become part of that without anyone naming it, without permission, simply by showing up and not leaving. Daniel looked between them, his wife, his daughter upstairs, the woman who had once been a symbol of everything he resented, and was now something else entirely. He thought of the path that had brought them here, the cracks and the silence, and the moments when he'd believed he was finished. He realized now he hadn't been ending. He'd been beginning. The stars outside gleamed through the window, sharp against the night, scattered across the sky like Sophie's crayons had drawn them into existence. Daniel wrapped his hands around the warmth of the mug, listening to the quiet rhythm of laughter and breath around him. For the first time in years, the world didn't feel like it was demanding he prove his worth. It simply felt like home. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story may be the one you didn't know you needed. Until then, stay kind, stay brave, and never stop listening.